monitor those emissions and by showcasing action being taken by London boroughs and ReLondon. Just to provide an overview of the event. So we're going to shortly have an intro from Kate and Dipti, who are going to introduce the key findings from the 2001 to 2020 London consumption-based emissions accounts and links to the One World Living programme. We'll then be followed by Dr. Anne Owen introducing the methodology behind the local accounts and introducing the new online CBE account tool for local authorities. We'll then move on to a panel discussion and then a Q&A. Just to quickly introduce the panel, so we've got Kate Hand. Kate is Head of Climate Change at London Councils. We've got Dr. Anne Owen, the Senior Research Fellow at University of London. Pauline Matevia, Head of Business and Sector Support, ReLondon. Dipti Patel, the Corporate Director for Place at London Borough of Harrow. And Arun Rao, Principal Policy and Programmes Officer at the GLA. A big thank you to our panel today for joining us and being part of this. I'll now hand it over to Kate and Dipti to take over.
Thank you so much, Krupa. Can we have the slides up, please? Thank you, Catherine. Perfect. Lovely. So thank you very much, Krupa, and thank you for chairing today. I'm really excited to be seeing so many people here and to be presenting our updated account. So I'll be explaining the key messages from the data and then handing over to Dipti Patel to talk through a little bit of the One World Living programme. So firstly, I'm sure colleagues are really aware, but what are consumption-based emissions? Just a quick explanation. You are probably familiar with territorial accounts. So those allocate emissions to the country in which they take place. Those are the ones that states are required to publish. By contrast, consumption-based emissions accounts allocate emissions to the final consumers in each country. So CBE accounts reflect Londoners' consumption, and crucially, that includes supply chain emissions. And as Krupa mentioned, we'll say a bit more about her methodology in a moment, but she's very much better placed to do that than I am. So next slide. So just briefly also, why do we commission this account? And we're very proud of it, and we're proud of the innovative nature of both the regional and absolutely the borough level accounts. But I'm sure you're aware that the Mayor of London and London boroughs have very ambitious targets for reaching net zero and adapting to climate change. It's an absolutely huge priority across London government. But you know, this account really enables us to reach into areas that territorial emissions don't reach in order to help us meet that target. As Krupa mentioned, London's consumption-based emissions are 2.5 times higher than our territorial emissions. So the account enables us to understand and then, of course, to target action that reflects demand and highlights new emissions hotspots and to be more effective in our climate action. So moving on to the key messages on the next slide. So firstly, London continues to see annual reductions in consumption-based emissions, which is in line with the overall UK trend. And because of rising population in our city, the per capita reductions are even greater. So you can see overall emissions have dropped by 32% since 2001 up to 2020. Per capita, that's 43%. And then household emissions, I will come on to the difference that what segment that represents, have dropped 39% per capita. That's nearly 50%, so quite significant in London's case. And the next slide really illustrates that drop. If we can have the next slide, yeah, lovely. So as you can see, general downward trend. You will note particularly steep falls around 2008, around the financial crisis, and around 2018, which reflects changes in car fuel use as well as COVID in London. And you'll see that it sort of starts earlier than COVID, and we think that reflects reductions in car fuel use related to the ULEZ adoption. It is also important to note that grid decarbonisation has played a big part in the decline over that kind of 20-year period. So next slide, the second main message is that we have, as I mentioned, two parts to the footprint. So we've got the household bit, that's food, housing, transport, goods and services. And then we've got what is called government and capital investment consumption. So that second part is really important, but because it's a UK-wide average, what we have for London. We're not able to look any further into data. So if you look at the changes over time, it doesn't say anything very much about London's particular activity. So in our account and in the rest of this presentation, we focus on household emissions. And as you can see, the key aspects of the household emissions are transport, or the biggest segments, transport, housing, and that includes emissions embedded in materials that we use to build buildings, and food. And that's both food eaten in the home, as well as food eaten out of the home, which in this account actually sits in services. But if we think of food in the round, that's really important. So then if you compare 2019 to 2020, which I'll illustrate on the next slide, you can see really significant reductions as we start to see the impact of COVID, thank you, Catherine, on transport and services. So this, what you can see here is that food and housing and goods, sorry, are almost exactly the same. Goods are actually slightly higher, but it really is so small that you can't really see it on this slide. But you see in the green section there, that's transport, nearly a 30% drop in transport emissions from 2019 to 2020. So that reflects, as I mentioned, car fuel use, but also reductions in, as anyone who lives in or was anywhere near London remembers, reductions in public transport and in aviation as well. We also see a 20-odd% decrease in services, which is the blue section at the top there, which is mainly reductions on private healthcare, but also restaurants and cafes. Again, not at all surprising when you remember what happened during COVID. So moving on, the third big message is that London has the lowest per capita emissions of any UK region in 2020. And on the next slide, you can see a breakdown across all the government regions. There we go. You can see London on the left there. So our food, housing, transport and goods are all lower than average across the UK regions. Services emissions are actually higher than the average, but because it's a relatively small portion, as you can see, it doesn't take us over that kind of bottom spot. It is worth noting that in 2001, London had about average consumption-based emissions for the UK regions. So we've actually seen the steepest decline amongst the regions to reach that kind of positive bottom spot in 2020. Moving on, the fourth main message, moving on to the borough account, which is a really innovative aspect of the work we've done here, or the work that Anne has done here. So every borough has seen a reduction in their consumption-based emissions across that 20-year period. And borough emissions are reasonably similar, but there is quite a big difference between the highest and the lowest. And I will flag at this point that, of course, we look at things on borough boundaries, but consumption emissions are closely linked to incomes. So, you know, borough boundaries are probably less important than the wealth of a particular group, and that means that there's good opportunities amongst our more affluent citizens to reduce consumption-based emissions. Particularly, we know that many Londoners are struggling right now. So if we move to the next slide, we can see the full breakdown across the boroughs, and I know for all my borough colleagues, this is the slide. As I said, it's a relatively similar picture, but you'll see that the lowest emitting borough, that's Newham, has 6.31 tonnes per capita, and that's almost about two-thirds of the highest, which is City of London on 9.6 tonnes per capita. In terms of the split across those different household areas, again, as you can see, reasonably similar, and that reflects the overall London split across those themes. You probably see them, you do see the most variation in the transport section, that's that green section, which largely reflects inner and outer London boroughs. And the final key messages slide is that although we are going in the right direction, reductions are not currently enough to get us to our one world living target of a 2/3 reduction in consumption emissions by 2030, or to achieve net zero by 2030. We know that much of the action required is structural, so big changes to housing and to transport. We need better redistribution infrastructure. We need to do more around things like repair and renting and shared services and the broader circular economy, which ReLondon, of course, can speak to in more detail. But that structural action has to go hand in hand with a change to the way that we live as Londoners, that we eat and travel and shop. So there is behaviour change here, but our role as London government is to provide the right enabling conditions so that people can make those good choices. That's it from me. I'll hand over to Dipti.
Thank you, Kate. I'm Dipti Patel from the London Borough of Harrow. In terms of, I wanted to talk about the One World Living programme. So as the lead of the One World Living programme, which is one of the 7 London-wide climate programmes that have been established by London councils, this is very much a collaborative programme. Harrow is coordinating this, but we are working in partnership with West London Waste Authority and ReLondon, along with partners from the academic community and a number of boroughs who are leading on the themes. It's a system change, particularly encouraging the circular economy, minimising the use of raw materials, keeping products and materials in use for as long as possible, fully recycling materials and allowing nature to regenerate. So really that's the fundamental focus for the One World Living programme. There are 4, the focus is reduce consumption emissions across London, and the 4 theme areas are led by 4 of our boroughs. So food is led by Hackney, textiles is Wandsworth, plastics is Richmond, and electricals is Hammersmith and Fulham. And we want to, as Kate has highlighted, achieve a target of 2/3 reduction by 2030. It's a high ambition requiring large-scale public action alongside policy and structural changes. Next slide, please. So normalising these new attitudes and behaviours around diet, sustainable product choices, food waste, repairs, reuse, recycling and refill. We're facilitating a bottom-up change by enabling the scaling up of many small individual consumption actions, and in order to make together make a big change. We've identified and act on the points of intervention where local authorities can help remove the barriers and therefore enable this bottom-up change. We want to tell stories about and articulate a vision for the future of sustainable lifestyles that engage the heads, the hands and our hearts. Consumption-based emissions accounting can draw attention to the emissions embodied in London, often out of sight but should not be out of mind. Next slide, please. So we really wanted to touch on one of the key programmes that's just been launched in April, which is Eat Like a Londoner. It's about collaboration between ReLondon, OWL and other partners, and it's jointly funded by 27 boroughs. It's a great example of pan-London campaign at scale to try and prompt new low carbon consumption patterns. So it's focusing on reducing food waste, promoting a sustainable diet, and the key message really is to save money, eat better and help the planet. A lot of advertising that's gone on, both in supermarkets and transport hubs, and we've seen over 27,000 clicks and 1 million video views. And I would really encourage people to have a look at the link and some really great tips in terms of moving forward. So really, I think this is really an opportunity to ask were there any questions, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Dipti. Thank you very much. I can't see any questions that have gone up or any raised hands at the moment. So what I would do is we'll take all the questions at the end of the discussion. So if anyone does have anything, please keep them in mind, pop them in the chat, and we can take everything towards the end when we go to our discussion. So now just moving on to Dr. Anne Owen, who's done some amazing work. So I'll let her introduce the methodology behind the local account. Anne?
Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm here to introduce and launch you to LACA, which is the Local Authority Consumption Account website, which we're launching at the same time as the report today. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why I've done this work and a tiny bit about the methodology, because no one wants to go into the deep maths behind it. One of the challenges, which is trying to work out how much people spend and what do they spend their money on in the boroughs and the local authorities, I'm going to show you what the website looks like and how you can find it, and then talk a little bit about how we can keep this project going into the future and find out what those emissions are going to be post-COVID. Next slide, please. So over 300 UK local authorities have declared a climate emergency and are taking action to report and reduce their emissions. And the challenge is to both consider the territorial emissions, so the emissions that are located within the boundary, and also those consumption emissions. Consumption emissions in the UK are always larger than the territorial emissions because we are a nation that imports more than it exports. The consumption-based account has been reported at the UK level for over a decade now, and you can find it on DEFRA's website. But if local authorities want to report this, they've so far been blind to what their consumption emissions are because this data just doesn't exist. And it's important to consider consumption emissions because so many of the climate policies that we talk about in terms of emissions reduction target what consumers are buying. And so you need a consumption approach to be able to account for this and find out how effective it is. For example, the Eat Like a Londoner campaign, which looks at diets and what food shopping people are doing, can only really be measured from a consumption approach. Territorial is not going to cut it because the food is not always grown in the area where it's eaten. So I received funding from PCAN, which is the Place-Based Climate Action Network, to try and unlock some of these consumption options by providing consumption-based accounts for every local authority in the UK. Basically, the way these are calculated is you have a carbon multiplier, which is the carbon emissions per pound, so UK pound spent, some surveys that understand how people spend their money, so on what goods and how much, and other sort of geodemographic data, so sort of spatial data about places. Next slide, please. So as I said, you can find the official UK carbon footprint on DEFRA's website, and the 2020 results have literally this month arrived, but we need to be able to break this down to the local level. Can you just hit next for me? So the carbon footprint is the sum of all greenhouse gases associated to meet the demand for goods and services by UK residents, regardless of where in the world the emissions were emitted. So this means that we understand the emissions that occur in China, making electrical products that are then bought in the UK. It gets slightly more complicated when you try and break this down to the local level. What happens to the emissions associated with delivery drivers in London when they're dropping off parcels? What happens to the emissions of tourists who are visiting all of the landmarks? Where do they go? If you're really strict about what we mean by consumption, it ends up being quite easy to allocate them. When we're talking about this type of account, we're looking at what are the residents doing. So anything that is bought by somebody who lives in London gets allocated to the London footprint. So this means that if you're a tourist and you spend some money, it will only be allocated to London if you're actually from London. Otherwise, it goes back to the place where the tourist lives. And once you make this distinction, you can sort of take the UK emissions and share them out accordingly. Next slide, please. The approach I'm using is the hierarchical approach. Essentially what this means is I take the top level amount, which is the UK, and share it out to the devolved regions, so England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Then within England, I share it out to all of the government office regions, of which Greater London is one. And then once I have that, I then share the footprint out to the lower level geographies, which in this case is the London councils. Next slide, please. So the challenge that I need to overcome is to understand what share of UK level spend is allocated to London And then I need to know what share is allocated to each of the boroughs to be able to distribute this footprint accordingly. So essentially the question I'm asking is, what percentage of London's total spend on sofas goes to people living in Harrow, and what percentage goes to each of the other London councils? Fortunately, expenditure profiles exist at the Government Office region level, and these are collected by the Office of National Statistics. It's part of the data that goes into the Consumer Price Index, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about recently. So we're fairly confident that we have an idea as to how London spends its money. It's just getting it down to the lower level, which formed part of the methodological challenge here. Next slide, please. The ideal thing would be to try and understand exactly what everybody in each London borough is spending their money on, but that gets a little bit Big Brother, and we don't have the resources to do that. So essentially what we do is we use something called geodemographic classifications. You've probably heard of big sort of marketing companies like Experian. They create profiles of the types of people that live in each area. I didn't want to use data like that. I wanted to use free open source data. So I use an expenditure profile data set produced based on the UK census, and it classifies all of the tiny neighbourhoods within each local authority into 60 different household types, and we've got a spend profile based on all of them. This means that we can add up the spend from all of the small neighbourhoods to give us a total spend profile for the whole of the borough. And if we can work out what proportion this spend is of the London spend, then we can share the footprint out accordingly. One thing that I've worked hard on to try and provide a higher level of accuracy here is to replace some of the data with more accurate data when it becomes available. So, for example, I know exactly what local authorities spend, well, residents in local authorities spend on their electricity and gas, because this is a data set that's produced by DESNZ now. And so I can replace estimated spends with these real datas. I also ensure that this is a region. I don't want the profiles to be based on their national level. I want them to be a share of the London level. So I am able to pick up peculiar behavioural insights from London, such as the very high spend on public transport and lower spend on petrol, which is typical of a London resident. So although these profiles are used, they are regionalised in nature. Next spend, please. Sorry, next slide. So now I'm going to introduce you to the LACA website. London has really led the way in commissioning this more localised data on consumption-based accounts. And when I was working with London to produce these, I realised that it wasn't a huge extra amount of work to collect the data for the whole of the country at the same time. So I started doing that. And in 2020, I got additional funding from PCAN to produce this website where I can disseminate this data. And the hope is that local authorities can view this, compare themselves with other local authorities, and download the data all for free. Next slide, please. So this is what the website looks like. There are several things that you can do with this. Can you just hit next for me? At the top, you can decide whether you want to view a snapshot, so a single year, or whether you want to view a time series and see how your emissions have changed over time. Next. The next thing you do is to choose which region of the country you want to look at. As I said, it's hierarchical, so you can start with the UK and go lower and lower and lower until you get to the local authority level, or you can search by name for the local authority that you're interested in. Then you can choose what you want to look at, whether you want to look at all products, or whether you want to specifically focus on food, or whether within food you want to look at the difference between meat and vegetables. Next, you can choose which year. Obviously, everyone's very interested in 2020, but the data does exist from 2001 to 2020. And finally, next, you can choose whether you're looking at the emissions on a per capita or a total basis. Next, please. This is a view on comparing footprints of selected local authorities, and you can see I've compared Kensington and Chelsea with areas that are more local to me, including York and Leeds. And you can see the breakdown by broad product group. Next slide, please. And here you can see I've done a similar thing, but I've compared restaurants and cafes over time for 3 selected areas. Next slide, please. And the website is now available, so you can go back to your desks and look it up. It's on www.localfootprint.uk. Next. So as consumption accounting moves up the political agenda, I'm hoping that more and more local authorities are going to want to report this. Now, the results are only really going to be meaningful if they are developed in a manner that's consistent with the national level. So I think we need a system which is using the same data sources and the same methodology throughout. I'm hoping that LACA is going to become the national standard for local authority consumption accounting. And, you know, with support from ReLondon and the GLA and local councils, I will be able to continue this with the bare minimum. But if I want to improve the website and add more features, I'm afraid that's going to need more sustained funding. So if anyone's got any bright ideas about what I can do to raise some funds to make some improvements, please get in touch. But as I said, I do have the means to be able to do this year's release and next year's, and they will all come out at the same time when the national results come out, which is June. So the 2021 results will be available around this time next year. Next slide, please. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you ever so much. And maybe we've got time for some questions.
Thank you very much, Anne. That's been really useful. I've seen the questions popping up on the chat, so I'll go to them in a second. We're just going to kick off quickly with a panel discussion. What I'm going to do is ask all the panel members firstly, just to do a quick one-line intro of what they're doing the day-to-day roles. So our people on Teams can have a better idea of what you all do. So I'll start off with you, Kate.
Thanks, Cooper. So I'm head of climate change at London Councils, which is the collective of the London boroughs. In my day job is supporting the London boroughs, but I particularly focus on climate finance, the overlap with our infrastructure work and also our policy and advocacy work around climate.
Thank you. Dr. Anne Owen.
Hi, I'm Dr. Anne Owen. I'm an associate professor at the University of Leeds. My main role is calculating these consumption-based accounts. My particular interest is understanding household behaviour in terms of how they contribute to increasing emissions and what households can do to mitigate them.
Thank you. Pauline?
Hello, good morning. Very happy to be here today. So I'm Pauline. I'm the head of business and sector support for ReLondon. So ReLondon, we are a partnership between the 33 boroughs and the Greater London Authority. And our mission is really to develop the circular economy, both to reduce waste, but probably more importantly here today, to tackle consumption-based emission in London. And my role is to work with businesses, also support boroughs and support specific sectors to develop the circular economy and tackle consumption-based emissions.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Dipti?
Hello, I'm Dipti Patel. I'm the Corporate Director of Place at the London Borough of Harrow. I am responsible for a range of place-based services from environment, housing, regen, economic development, property, but one of the key things, and again leading on the climate agenda for Harrow and achieving net zero. So we're currently going out to consultation on our new policy that we've just drafted as a refresh of the climate strategy, and I think clearly leading on the One World Living programme is quite core to what we're achieving.
Thank you, Dipti. And finally, Aaron?
Hi, yes, Aaron Rao here. So I work in the environment team at the GLA, and my day-to-day role is actually working on new build energy policies as part of the London plan. But that does also include our whole life cycle carbon policy, which is got a bit of a crossover with the consumption-based emissions work. So yeah, alongside that, I do also lead on the consumption-based emissions work we have, and obviously working closely with Kate and Pauline and Anne and everyone else on this work.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to fire off with a couple of questions. My first question to Pauline. So as a board member of ReLondon, I know that ReLondon do fantastic work on London's circular economy. For you, how does the CBE account enable us to understand and take action on the circular economy?
Yeah, thanks, Cooper. So I think this is so important and it's essential both to understand why we need to take action on the circular economy and then how and where we can have the most impact. So on the why, I think it has been said by several people, but considering that consumption-based emission is 2.5 times higher than territorial emissions, it actually means that most of the impact we have on climate through the way we consume and live in London are arising because of the stuff we import. Well, the territorial emissions, the transport, heating our house, etc. It's important, but most of the emissions arise actually outside of the city boundaries because of the stuff and the material we import. So the circular economy is really key to make sure we make the best use of those material in import, promoting reuse, repair, sharing, recycling model that will kind of reduce our need to import and to have such massive impact on the climate. And on the how, it's really to, this is important to retarget the sectors where we can have the most influence. And the good news is that boroughs and local authorities in general have lots of levers to develop the circular economy. So we talked about the communication to citizen side of things with the Eat Like a Londoner campaigns, but there are so many things that local authorities can do and that we are working with boroughs, such as using procurement power, working to support businesses in this area, or by using some regulatory power, especially around planning, because construction, the emission associated with construction material is huge. So yeah, influencing the way our buildings are built is very important too.
Thank you, Pauline. The next question to Aaron. The GLA take the regional strategic overview for London. Going forward, how are you looking to use this data to inform your work?
Thanks. Yeah. So currently we do have a net zero 2030 target, which the Mayor has set, but that only includes territorial emissions. And on consumption-based emissions, we just currently have a commitment in the environment strategy to report on these emissions. And as Kate mentioned, that's what we've been doing for a few years now. So I think going forward, obviously, it's been discussed. It's quite an interesting area. It's a contentious area because you are kind of dealing with people's behaviors and consumption profiles and stuff that is inherently can be quite personal. So I think from our point of view, what we're really interested to know is how we can make the best use of this data to understand where can we take action, maybe on the other side of things. So for example, deliveries of different materials and food and other things like that, where we could perhaps influence some policies there and stuff which maybe isn't directly targeted at individuals and trying to make them do something which could be, they could maybe be defensive, and there's a whole area around there which I think has been mentioned does need to be addressed. But it'd be interesting to see what we can do to bring down some of the emissions and maybe in the background and using the data we have to really focus that work. I think as also has been mentioned about how much the decarbonisation of the grid has played a part in the reduction over the last 20 years. Once we start hopefully getting to a point where that's kind of leveling off and becoming close to zero carbon, it'll be really interesting to see the data then and understand where are the key areas which will require more focus. And again, as I was saying, what kind of policies can we implement at a London level to reduce that before we start looking at anything else? Well, normally not before. Obviously, these two things need to happen at the same time, but it's just good to know what can we focus our action on that's going to have a sort of background impact, whilst also dealing with how we can change people's consumption profiles.
Brilliant, thank you. And now just a quick fire round question for each of our panel members before I move on to the questions in the chat. So to everyone, what was for you the most interesting finding from this year's release, and how can we use it to drive action on reducing emissions? I'll kick off with Anne.
Thank you. I was really excited about doing 2020 because obviously this is the year where everything changed. So I think the thing that I was most interested to investigate was how the effects of COVID were different in different places of the UK. And you can really start to see the unique character of different parts of the UK, because obviously places where you've got a high commute by car, we saw much larger emissions reductions than places which were less reliant on car use. And I think that's one of the reasons why we didn't see such a huge reduction in London. And we saw very little reductions in Northern Ireland, which I think is a reflection of the fact that the lockdowns were slightly different in different parts of the country. So I found that absolutely fascinating. I'm sure there's so much we can learn from how people changed their behaviours in the pandemic when we're thinking about what we can do to try and reach net zero.
Thank you. Yes, I think we just saw a huge difference in how people are living the day-to-day life during the pandemic. So that's really useful. Dipti?
So I think really echoing what Anne was saying, I think the information was really, really helpful, and an opportunity to really focus more locally in terms of some of the challenges and the changes that people are experiencing. So for me, looking at, how people's behaviour can change, what can we do differently, how can we support them post-pandemic, because I think it has changed people's model of living and how they want to be more sustainable potentially. And we are now, as I said, talking about going out to consultation on our new strategy. So this is a real opportunity to use this as a really good framework in terms of focus on that.
Thank you. Kate?
So for me, lots of interesting things, but around the food footprint, it's really noticeable when you'll come to read the report how big meat is as a part of that. It's more than 50% of the footprint, and that's common across the UK. But that is a big opportunity to reduce emissions. As someone who lives in a half vegetarian, half carnivore household, I know that can be a challenging discussion, but it's not about being vegetarian or vegan. It's about reducing your overall consumption of meat, and I think that's something we need to find a way of talking about that is culturally sensitive and appropriate, but also reflects, the emissions associated with that choice.
Thank you. Pauline?
Yeah, well, I guess in addition to what others have said, maybe one thing for me is, well, we obviously talk a lot about household consumption because this is, it has a lot of impact on these emissions. But actually, when you look at the whole consumption-based emission diagram, like a third of it comes from emissions associated with government spending and also with kind of capital infrastructures. So this is stuff that households can't change with their kind of day-to-day life, but this is things that we can definitely influence as government kind of spending money on. And also, the capital is mainly like the buildings, the infrastructure. So this is also an area where it's not about household kind of changing their consumption habit. This is about the whole industry changing the way they develop and they think about new development projects.
Thank you. Aaron?
Yeah, so that's actually a few things which maybe doesn't fully answer the question, but things that I thought were interesting. One, that London was pretty much at the bottom of all the regional profiles. Secondly, looking at the sectors which didn't really vary, even though we were in lockdown. So I think household energy use and food and drink, which I thought was quite interesting, considering obviously there were such big changes to how we were living our lives. And thirdly, I know this was sort of more of an insinuation, but the potential impact of ULEZ that we could see from previous years that was still tracking down. I thought that was really interesting. And obviously it's a very hot topic in London. So any kind of data around that I do find really interesting.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to move on to the questions that we've got in the chat. I'll ask the panel members just to jump in and respond to them as soon as I read them out. So whoever wants to go in can just go for it. So the first question I have is from Sebastian. Do you have any expectations for what the data will show for the post-pandemic period when it's available? I worry if emissions have partly bounced back as restrictions have eased. Who would like to jump in on that one? Go for it, Anne.
I'll take first go. Yeah, we won't really be able to see this, I think, until we get data for 22 and 23. And the 2022 data, I won't be able to calculate until 2025. So we have a bit of a delay here. I think we are going to see a bounce back. It will bounce back to the year when everything was more normal, which is 2019. But I don't think we'll see a bounce back to the level of 2019 because we've also got a lot of other overriding trends which are running through the data, particularly in terms of the decarbonisation of the electricity sector. So although I think we will see a slight uptick, I don't think we're going to return to the levels of 2019 because we've got this other underlying trend happening at the same time. And I think there are also a lot of good post-pandemic behaviours that we've carried on with. I mean, the fact that we're all meeting virtually for this event has meant that we've not, all travelled to London to do this. So, yeah, I think there are things that we will see continue, but we are going to see a slight uptick again.
Thanks, Anne. Anyone else want to come in on that one, or I'll move to the next question? Okay. This question is from Grace. How are the per capita emissions allocated in comparison to visitors to a borough? Example, is City of London highest due to people travelling in for work tourism?
I think I might have to come in on this because it's a technical one. So yeah, I saw this question actually come up when I was giving the presentation, and I tried to sort of give a bit of a hint as to this. As I said, it's based on a residence basis. So the fact that some boroughs have a higher tourist numbers coming to them isn't reflected in the consumption emissions. And this is one of the important reasons why I wouldn't ever want the consumption profile to overtake or be seen as more important than other ways of measuring emissions in the boroughs. We need to measure the production emissions, so the emissions associated with the traffic within a borough and the buildings within the boundary, as well as the consumption emissions, and get 2 bites of the cherry to try and reduce it. So some emissions generating activities are better targeted from a production perspective, and visitors would be that. And others, such as the behaviour, the food, the spending habits of residents, are better looked at from a consumption perspective. And I think that possibly answers the question below it, which was about flying.
Yes, tourists.
Yeah,
I mean,
London.
So are emissions from tourists flying to London allocated to their own country? Is there a risk that London continues to promote itself as a key tourist destination without promoting low carbon transport modes?
Yeah, so again, I would argue that we mustn't ignore this. Emissions from flying are huge, and I wouldn't want people to stop this idea of trying to get people to visit London using more sustainable means of transport. But I'd also argue that looking at the aviation footprint of Londoners is particularly important. If we're launching a sort of campaign to think about sustainable travel, sustainable tourism, some boroughs in London have some of the highest aviation footprints in the country because we have residents that go on a lot of foreign holidays. Also, don't forget cruise holidays are particularly high as well. So an awareness raising campaign on some of those big hitting items would be something that I think would be really important.
Thank you. Another question from Claire. What is the difference between this tool and the impact tool?
Okay, I'm not particularly familiar with the impact tool. Could someone else jump in and help me on this one?
I'm afraid I'm not familiar with it, so I can't help Claire. It's University of Exeter and days, so I don't know if that helps.
I think what we can do is look into it, and if you do have any questions, you drop us an email and then we can get back to you on that one. Thank you for the question. The next question, are business-based consumption data captured in the account?
Indirectly. So again, it's the consumption of the residents is the sort of final destination of the emissions. So all the emissions get allocated to the point of final demand, so final purchase. So businesses are part of the supply chain. So if London businesses are making a product that is bought by somebody in London, then yeah, it's going to be part of the consumption footprint. But if London businesses are making a product that's bought outside of the boundary, then it goes to the place where the person is from who bought it.
Thanks.
Can I just jump in? I guess
Sure,
like to follow up on this question, and also maybe on the earlier question about does it include kind of also tourist consumption or like workers
Sure.
consumption? I think it's good to recognize what the data show and doesn't show. But in the meantime, some of the actions that we're taking to tackle emissions associated with Londoners' emissions will also have a knock-on effect on the emissions associated with tourist consumption or workers' consumption. Maybe one good example is emissions associated with restaurants and with the food consumed within with restaurants or food businesses. So at ReLondon, we've been working, and it was part of the One Living program as well, with restaurants, like working with environmental health practitioners in the borough of Hackney to train them to talk to restaurants when they go to restaurants, so that they talk to restaurants owners and advise them on how best they can reduce their food waste. And this action, it obviously has an impact on, when Londoners go to restaurants, but, for restaurants, they don't really care if people, when they come, are from London or not. So I think it's a signal, and I don't believe we miss that much when not having those emissions, because ultimately it still gives a very good overview of where the hotspots are. And you can assume that, consumption from tourists and workers, will follow the same trend. Typically when they go to restaurants, it will follow the same trends because just of the way they operate, like restaurants operate, for example. So I think it's, let's not, just look at what the data gaps are, but look at kind of the overall trends. And I think it will definitely help us targeting the right actions.
Thank you, Pauline. Kate?
Thank you. I'll just jump in on that as well. It's an important point about carbon intensity as well, isn't it? So, if you look at the kind of restaurant and cafe spend during COVID going down, that's not really a good thing. It's not good for Londoners being able to get together. It's certainly not good for people who own or work in restaurants. That's not we don't want to see that necessarily going down. What we want to see is like much reduced carbon intensity of that sector, as kind of Pauline's outlined. And just going back to the question now that I've had time to mull it over on private transport, or well, it was on private transport, but like post 2020 results. And I think we will see private transport bounce back. And that's generally the anecdotal picture that we've had, not even anecdotal, from TfL data, kind of across the boroughs and across Greater London. That will vary now, and obviously we're seeing additional changes to the London transport system at the moment, but we are also seeing the rollout, for example, of trials and greater availability of e-bikes and e-scooters. So the carbon intensity of private transport in that respect is coming down. So it'll be really interesting to see how that starts to mitigate that trend. So we don't want to stop people travelling, but we want to reduce the carbon intensity of how they're doing that. Typically, public transport is the best way to do that. But there are also other options. So it'll be something for us to think about as we kind of consider the data trends going forward.
Thank you, Kate. Moving on to the next question from Kat. She's very excited to explore the data. Thank you for the analysis and website. And yes, Kat will be sending out all the links, slides and everything at the end of the event. Thank you very much for joining. Jackson has asked, are there limitations with data in reflecting local climate action that may reduce consumption emissions? Are the data sets used outside of census database based on a small sample size of people across the UK?
Yeah, this is a really, really good question. And you're right to have these concerns. The household expenditure surveys that we used are from the Living Costs and Food Survey, which is a huge national survey produced by the Office of National Statistics. And again, it's part of the survey that goes into forming the Consumer Price Index. So it's a really high quality survey. But there are only around 1,000 to 600 surveys that are specifically for London. So if there was a London-wide campaign on changing diets, you'd have to hope that the reach of that campaign reaches the people that are surveyed in the Living Costs and Food Survey. I think if the campaign was incredibly localised, so say it was focusing on a particular neighbourhood or a particular borough, I don't think that's then going to be reflected in this national survey. But things that are London-wide, like the ULEZ, we are seeing that reflected in some of the spend pattern data that we're getting through. So yeah, there are some issues and you have to be aware of this. And I've written a detailed methodology document which tries to be very honest about the approach that we've taken. So thank you for your question.
Thanks. And the final question on our chat, will there be any impact on the stats caused by shifting populations during COVID and the impact this had on census data, i.e. individuals returning to family homes outside of London during lockdown?
Again, I'll just shed a bit of light on that. So the data uses up-to-date output area population estimates as one of the data inputs to the model. And these are produced annually. So we will see changes in the population size at the borough levels. So we should see the fact that there were increases perhaps with children coming home to live with their parents rather than going to university. The Living Cost and Food Survey also gives you information about the character of the household that it's taking the spend profiles of. So I haven't done this yet, but I could investigate whether the character of households that are from London change slightly from being, I don't know, two parents to two parents with older children, whether we see that. Yeah, so it should be reflected, but I haven't done an in-depth analysis to work out what the effect of that was.
Thanks. And Kate?
Thanks, Cooper. I just wanted to come back to Jackson's question, his very good question. I think we need to have a kind of conversation around about how we measure action in this area. So clearly this survey does a huge amount for us to kind of illuminate a picture that we were blind to basically at the borough level. But then obviously boroughs are going to want to understand, and the One World Living programme will want to understand, what is the impact of our actions. And it's hard, I think, to measure. So I think it's not to speak for Deputy, is something for the programme to consider. I know it is considering it, but how do we reflect the impact of work that, in our case, boroughs are undertaking, programmes, campaigns, initiatives, back into this kind of data set? And I think it's probably a kind of sort of I'm not an academic, but a kind of mixed methods approach. So, having some kind of qualitative, smaller survey work, kind of what is the impact of this intervention? How could that roll out with the kind of bigger picture? What we shouldn't seek to do, which is probably unfair, is to say, as Anne's indicated, is, the One World Living programme has worked really hard on textiles here. We'll look at the, the textiles consumption-based emission account as the only reflection of that, because it won't be, but it's a really important overall trend that we can use. And obviously, hopefully boroughs will individually find that really useful, both in kind of saying what the big picture is in terms of what they're doing, but also just communicating to residents, because I think that's always powerful, isn't it? It's not just to go back to my previous example, people generally eat, lots of meat, and that has an impact on the climate, but actually residents in Europe, where I live, eat whatever proportion it is, and we want to have a conversation with you about how we can address those impacts. So yeah, I think it's a kind of complicated conversation to be had there, but a really useful point.
Pauline?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Kate. I think the good thing with the data, it gives the overall trend. So it gives, from borough perspective, it gives you a sense of where you want to focus your action, the kind of sector you want to target your action to. But then when you start working on those sectors, you need to probably other ways to kind of monitor more in more kind of granular way. One thing we've done as ReLondon is we've developed material flow analysis, where we map the flow of material and link it with consumption-based emissions. So we launched a report for the food sector in 2021, and we're just about to launch on Wednesday this week the fashion report. So working closely with the One World Living program again, and this is really useful to see more detail, and so more detail on within the material flow where you can have the most impact on the supply chain and on consumption-based emissions. So it probably doesn't solve everything. I think it's hard to have data for everything, but I think it's an important step to really understand where to focus action and to monitor the impact that our actions have.
Thank you, Pauline. I'm going to take the final question from the chat from Jackson. Some comparisons have been made between territorial and consumption emission values. Is it correct to say that consumption emissions include some most territorial emissions, transport, housing, albeit calculated with different methodologies?
Yes, obviously there are overlaps between the two, and any emissions associated with heating your home, obviously that sits in both the consumption and the territorial. The different methodologies is probably around the transport. So if you live in London and you're driving in London, that one sits in both. But if you are from outside of London where you live, but you're doing your driving within London, your personal driving, that would go back to where you live. So I think this is quite a sort of technical one, but I would definitely advise looking into the methodology report and looking closely at the Venn diagram, which tries to explain which ones sit in both accounts and which ones sit in both of them.
Thanks, Anne. Thank you very much for everyone's questions. Just a quick fire round for our panel before I close this. So if you could get one message from the CBE account to every single person today, what would it be? And I'll kick off with you, Anne.
Oh. I would say it's a really, really useful method for prioritization. I think as a sort of learning tool, understanding where the high points of your behavior sits, I think that's absolutely fascinating and could help you think about prioritizing areas for action.
Thank you. Dipti?
So, I mean, I think that in terms of the data and the information, it's a really good source of actually focusing where we need to make attention, and particularly in the One World Living programme, it's a fantastic programme. But actually, how do we look at the overarching data? What do we need to do? And again, for boroughs to use that information in a lot more focus, I think that's going to be really helpful.
Thank you. Pauline?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, the main message is really for local authorities, like, you know, in London and outside of London, to start thinking about how they can tackle consumption-based emissions. I think we are all, you know, it's all a bit early in the journey, like compared to actions taken to tackle territorial emissions. So really, yeah, understanding the impact you can have and putting it higher in your, you know, in your council agenda is probably, yeah, the main message from today.
Thank you. And Kate?
Excellent. I'm going to slightly cheekily repeat Anne's point, but add on it. So it is a tool for prioritisation, and we know that that is needed because Londoners don't always accurately understand where they can have the most impact. So our polling, we do annual polling on climate change attitudes in London, and we know that absolutely Londoners are really concerned about climate change. They are getting more concerned every year, and they want to do something, but they don't always understand where they can have the most impact. So people, as a bit of a generalization, sometimes think recycling is more impactful than it really is. You should do your recycling, absolutely, but it's not the most important thing when you're thinking about consumption-based emissions, and you can have an impact. But, you know, please do take a look at this and hopefully inform everyone about where they can have most impact and where councils need to support communities to take the right actions.
Thank you very much, Kate. Thank you to everyone for all your questions and comments today. It's been really appreciated. We'll just put on a final slide with the links, and we'll be sending this out to everyone who has attended today. I'd like to say a big thank you to all our speakers, and in particular to Dr. Anne Owen for producing this work. It has been a really useful conversation, and I hope all of you have found it really useful. Thank you to all the attendees for your engagement. Really encourage everyone to look at the reports that we have published today on the CBE account and use them to accelerate action to reduce emissions, and to also pass it on to your residents and have those conversations with your residents and your communities in your area. And I would like to encourage officers and members outside of London to make use of the tool outlining the local CBE accounts. Once again, thank you for joining us. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.